Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we are extremely lucky to be joined by Professor Louise Burke. Louise, would you be able to give our listeners a bit of a background about who you are and what you do?
I'm a sports dietitian. Hi to you all. And I'm currently working as the Chair of Sports Nutrition at the Mary McKillop Institute for Health Research at Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. Prior to that, I spent 30 years at the Australian Institute of Sport in Canberra, mostly as the head of sports nutrition with a team, and then in the last couple of years as Chief of Nutrition Strategy. And as I finished my time at the AIS, I found myself doing more research and less of the one-to-one athlete work. And so it made sense to then move into academia and take up a full-time role as a researcher, still working with elite athletes and what we can do in terms of sports nutrition. But again, just with a small team who are also dedicated to this role.
We're very appreciative because for those of our listeners who don't know who Louise is, you are very much a pioneer in this field, Louise, and your expertise is sought out internationally. So I know we'll say this at the end again, but thank you very much for taking the time, because it's not often that you get to speak with people of your level of involvement in a particular area. So I first just wanted to put that there.
You're being very kind, and that's just a nice way of saying I'm old, I think.
Well, there's a difference between being old and contributing a lot to a field, and you can decide whether you're old, but you've definitely contributed a hell of a lot to the field of particularly sports dietetics and sports performance in terms of nutrition. So thank you for taking the time. You have a number of areas that you've been involved in, particularly, as you said, it's evolved from being much more of that one-to-one, especially I know that you did a lot of work in your time at the AIS, really working with teams, working with athletes, and now it's evolved into academia. How have you found that transition, and are you enjoying that, or is that taking you away from some of the things that you're also very good at and maybe you miss a little bit?
Look, I do miss the day-to-dayness of working with athletes, and the way that we do research is providing that, mostly because we like to specialise in doing what we call research-embedded training camps, where we might have a group of athletes for 4 or 5 weeks embedded in the training environment with us, and we work with them to think of a research project or an area that they're interested to investigate. And so we work collaboratively with them, don't do research on athletes, but research with athletes. And by being involved in their daily training environment, that's where I get my athlete contact these days. But the other thing that it's doing, it's not just about me doing things I like, it's also sometimes providing resources for athletes to have a training camp environment that they couldn't otherwise organise for themselves. Sometimes we're bringing in international people together, or sometimes we're supporting a team that doesn't have the resources to do this kind of specialised training camp. And we're also tackling some area of research, and I love that idea that we get to work with athletes and answer some of the questions for them in a way where we've got data that they can believe in, and then that sort of solves some of those curly questions that keep popping up in people's minds. When we set up our studies, we try and really focus on ways in which we can get an outcome that will be meaningful. And one of the hardest things you'll ever do is measure sports performance in a way that is simulating what real life is, because often studies are done in laboratories and, you do time to exhaustion protocols on a bike or something, and that's a measure of exercise capacity. But you're never sure whether the participants in that study came in and gave it all on that day, so that, you really see the effect of that intervention that you were investigating. But when we set up our studies, we try and measure performance in a way, well, we've got competitive athletes who love to win anyway, but we try and set it up so it's a real life race, or there's a race that we've put on with prize money, and we're simulating the real thing, and we're trying to work with the athletes to get their confidence and their cooperation, so that when they do compete in whatever our performance protocol is, they really give it their all. And then at the end of it, we can all look back at the results and say, yep, that's they're pretty authentic, and whatever we found is likely to be a real result.
This seems to be something that is becoming more common, that people are working really hard to design research that is, as you said, in the field and implemented within an environment that is contextually appropriate. Do you think that we'll see more and more of this? Particularly, it's really changed, I think, the more we see wearable technologies as being the foundation for a lot of research, or at least, taking in some of that data. Do you think that we're going to see a general shift towards more and more of this, or do you think there is still a lot of space for, laboratory-based assessments and research? And I know you can probably never remove both of those, but it seems like people, one, as the consumer, people like coaches and athletes really enjoy these more contextually appropriate research settings. Do you think that that's going to be the general trend, or do you think that we might have a bit of a swing back the other way at some point?
That is such an insightful question, because I think that that's where we're heading, and we need to have, as you said, both parts of the problem investigated, because it's, sometimes you need the laboratory work to do the mechanistic underpinning investigation. You might need to be taking blood samples or muscle biopsies, or doing something where you've got control to see what's explaining what you see in performance. But then you really do need to take it to the field and put it into the contextual environment, and, with all the things that make up performance. So you've got the crowd, you've got the incentives, you've got the same pre-event meal, you've got performance being measured as exactly as it can be in real life. And so that's going to give you the sort of the pointy end performance thing. But then it's really helpful to understand why it occurs from the laboratory, because sometimes, if you're thinking about what you saw, you can't measure or you can't investigate absolutely every little thing. But if you could get something about the mechanism, maybe it's something about if you're a female versus a male, or if you're a female, it's something about the phase of the menstrual cycle that you're in. So if you've got a study that's done and we see a performance outcome, and then you can work out what the mechanism or the important characteristics might be that explain it, then you can say, oh, well, then it's possible that we can apply that same logic to these scenarios. And that makes you home in on where you might need to do your next bit of work with the performance measure to get the final thing. Or it might say, well, based on what we saw with this performance, because we understand the mechanism, we can probably, guess that there's a fair chance that it's going to happen in this way as well. So I think if you're clever with the way that you do research, you can get much more than just those couple of studies. You can sort of fill in lots of pieces of that big jigsaw, and start making the business of the context and the nuance of sport more able to be understood. But I think the important point you made is about how lucky we are now that we've got all these wearables, and not just the wearables, we've got performance analysts and people that can break down sports performance in such an interesting way. And it's through these two new improvements in sports performance understanding, I think that we're going to get some breakthroughs. It's not just having the wearables, because you can just get bucket loads of data till you're strangled by it. It's we need the people who can look at that and make some sort of sense of it and understand what it's meaning in terms of the performance outcome.
The interesting thing is, Jack and I talk about this a fair bit, it happens a lot in our world of physio. If it's, not applied research, people almost aren't willing to take it on. And we talk a lot because I guess, we tend to slant a little bit towards the academic side of things. And we really do like the nuance of the theoretical and mechanistic understanding, that often people are not willing to go and explore those things, or they think that it's too much of a jump when someone does go down that path. And I think one of the things that, we discussed in one of our discussions together was very much around not giving up on developing that mechanistic understanding, not giving up on, having some sort of hypothesis that the researchers are looking at, rather than it necessarily always being, well, it wasn't done with this very specific context, which I know probably sounds, I'm contradicting what I said before, but it's more about that nuance and that balance of saying, okay, we did see this happen in the context, but as you just mentioned, why does this happen? And what is the mechanism for why it affects this population differently? Because I know that you particularly have done some really interesting research looking at there was a lot of theoretical. I'll give an example. I actually spoke with you about this in person at the women's Women in Sport conference, a year and a half ago or so, and I asked you this question. I know that you were fabulous with it because you said, this is what we tried to do, and it didn't show what we thought, but it was around, people really pushing this idea of low carbohydrate intake, particularly for endurance athletes. And I know that you tried as hard as you could to potentially see if it would work, and you just couldn't necessarily replicate the result that theoretically people had in their mind as this hypothesis that would work. Can you maybe speak to that? Because what I was so impressed with the way that you explained it to me was that you weren't trying to prove that it couldn't work. You tried to find a way to make it work, and it just wasn't showing the results that people theoretically had come up with.
Well, thanks for asking that question, because it's funny. If you went to social media, you'd say, you find that I'm the anti-keto and that I've gone out of my way to show that it doesn't work. And I can't change the data, but what I can tell you is that our motive for going into it was to really get to the bottom of it, to have the advantage. Because, when you work with elite athletes, you want things to help them. You're always looking for something that can provide them that next 1% or the edge that they need. And it's more exciting to have that than it is to be saying, oh, nothing works. So we went into it saying, well, if there's absolutely anything there, we're going to find it, because the athletes that we were currently working with, the race walkers, they have, at that stage, they had a 50K event on their program for the Olympics, and that's a 3.5 hour event. And that's where it could get really useful to be able to have more fat contributing to the fuel source so that the carbohydrate can last longer, because 3.5 hours is a long time for your body's own carbohydrate stores to go the distance.
Would you be able to describe actually how you, like, I don't remember it as much detail as obviously you would know. So can you describe actually like what you tried to do? Because I remember going through it and asking you the questions, and it was very clever. You were trying to find, can we make this beneficial for our athletes? So for our listeners who haven't read those studies, go and have a look at them if you can. But Louise, can you describe what you tried to do in that setting with the race walkers?
Yes, so we had our research camp. So this was a 5-week camp, and we had international athletes coming, and these guys are incredible. The first study we did with all guys, and then there was some girls in the next one, so I'm calling them all guys just colloquially. We had them come and talk to us about their interest in the ketogenic diet, and the prevailing wisdom at the time was that if you could adapt by being on a very restricted carbohydrate, very high fat diet to being able to use muscle fat as a fuel source, then you would spare the carbohydrate that you did have and not bonk, hit the wall, whatever you want to call it, that depletion and fatigue associated with it in a race of the 50Ks. So we did something we're being criticised for, and that is we said to our athletes, yes, we all know the randomised controlled trial is, a lovely way of doing research, because you take out of it the ability of either the subject or the researcher to know what's going on and to bias the results. But when you're doing an intervention like the keto diet, you can't blind it. People know that they're on the keto diet by what they're eating. And so when you're working with elite athletes, and these were, we had some medalists from the Olympic Games and World Championships, and so you've got to be really careful that you don't interfere with their performance. They were, in our first study, about to go into qualifying for the Rio Olympic Games, and so you don't want to do something that is deliberately harming them or deliberately making them slower. So we said to the group of athletes that we've got 3 different ways in which you could fuel a training camp. you could either be on a carbohydrate-rich diet that was high carbohydrate for every training session. So breakfast, lunch and dinner, every session of exercise, there were carbs coming out your
Available,
ears.
yeah.
And
Carbs galore.
carbs galore. Then we had the new idea of periodizing carbohydrate, where we had exactly the same amount of total carbohydrate in the diet, but we changed the spread of it over the weeks so that some sessions were done with high carbohydrate availability, so plenty of pre-fueling and during fueling and recovery till the next important session. But some sessions were done fasted or with low glycogen because you'd had one session of exercise, hadn't eaten carbs until the next one, so that you started the second one with depleted glycogen stores. And then the third one was the keto diet. And what we did is we explained the pros and the cons of each of those principles of supporting training. And we said to each of the athletes, which do you think is going to be good for you? What would you think you'd get the most out of if you came for a training camp for 3 weeks and we had you do a 10K race, a 10,000 metre track race before it, and then you had this 3 weeks of intensified training, and then we got you to do another 10,000 metre track race afterwards. And we let them think about it, and they came back to us, and we were lucky that we basically ended up with getting, we were aiming for 10 in each group, and that's what we got. Actually, we had 9 in one of the groups. So we were able to match people with what they thought was going to be the best experience. And it turned out just, not luckily, just as the way things often work in the world, the athletes who were the better athletes actually wanted to try the keto diet because they'd heard about it. And so when we had a look at the baseline measurements, each of the groups wasn't equal to start with. And so we had to use statistics to be able to account for the fact that they had different performance levels to start with. But we were able to be feeling really comfortable that when they came to that second race, so the first race, everyone followed the high carbohydrate diet, and then we put them into 3 weeks of training on their different diets. And one of the things that we've tried to do with our camps is really control everything. So this was done at the Australian Institute of Sport, where there's a dining hall, and we actually hired a chef, and the chef came and cooked the meals that we wanted, so that they were wonderful. They were sort of more individually cooked for our group rather than going and picking it up from the bain marie. And we fed each athlete the exact diet that we wanted and monitored that they did it. We were able to supervise and collect statistics on every training session that they did, so that this was really robust control. And we're also really sure that when they came to that second race, everybody was on the starting line saying, I'm glad I got the good diet. And so that they really invested in the performance. And that's, as I said, when you're trying to ask an Olympic athlete to do 110% to race as hard as they can, you don't want them on the starting line thinking, oh,
I did the wrong diet.
What's the point of even trying today because I got the bad one? So, yes, we've been criticised for that decision, but I still think it's the best way of solving the situation.
You're 100% right. Like I coach sprinters, and unfortunately, whether you like it or not, if they think that the training they're doing or the setup that they're in is the right setup, they will do better than even if and there's no way of saying this is objective, but objectively they might be doing a better program somewhere else. But if they don't believe in it, it doesn't make a difference. They'll probably underperform. And that I think it's so valuable, and it's so interesting. That's what I found so interesting about the study, was that you actually selected not randomly, but based on people's preference to want to partake in that intervention group, which it sounds, as you said, it takes away some of those control elements, but actually I think it realistically represents what's going to give it the best chance of actually showing whether it works or not.
Well, thanks. I'm glad you see it the way I do.
As a coach, I would be disappointed if you did it the other way, to be honest with you, because I would interpret it that it was less relevant if you did it the opposite way. So I think it's the most contextually appropriate way to do it.
Well, thank you. And when we did the study, we found results that we were really surprised at, because the outcome was that the groups that had been on the carbohydrate, not everybody improved their performance. Let's be clear that over the 3 weeks of the training camp, everybody improved their VO2 max. So there was benefits of training, and one of the good things about our studies is that people improve as a result of just the experience. So that helps us when we're recruiting people to do a study, saying just the fact that you're all going to be here together, you're going to learn from us, you're going to learn from each other, you're going to push us hard in training, you're going to have fun with the atmosphere, the food's going to be good, it's going to be a fun experience. So that's good to have in the back of your mind when you're setting these things up. But we found that the carbohydrate-rich groups had not only improved their VO2 max, but they improved their race performance, whereas the group that was on the keto diet, despite being aerobically fitter, didn't get that improvement. And we were sort of surprised by that. We went back and had a look at some of the data, and because we'd not just measured race performance, we had them in the lab doing some work on a treadmill where we were measuring their metabolic characteristics. And when we looked at that data, I remember putting it in the spreadsheet and saying, this is really interesting. The group on the keto diet are now burning, well, they're doing the same speed on the treadmill, because that's how we've set up this study, but they're now using more oxygen than before. And I hadn't really thought through the implications of that. And I remember discussing it with one of my colleagues who's an older exercise physiologist from the days when you didn't have machines that did everything automatically for you. You had to do everything manually and then calculate stuff. And he looked at me as if I was completely dumb and said, Louise, 100 years ago, people knew this, that when you're thinking about the pathways by which fat and carbohydrate are aerobically producing ATP, even though we think about fat as having more calories per gram, it actually takes more oxygen to liberate the energy into ATP than it does carbohydrate. So that if you're thinking that the most important limit to performance is how much oxygen your mitochondria have to produce ATP from the fuel they've got, it's more economical to use carbohydrate by about 4 or 5%. And that's exactly what we saw.
Which is very significant.
It is very significant. People haven't really thought through this. And look, even this morning I looked on Twitter, and there was someone telling me that keto diets make people burn fat, and fat can sustain exercise intensities up to very high amounts, up to 80% of VO2 max. That's exactly right. We see that all the time. The key issue is how fast are you moving, or how much ATP are you producing, if you want to put it in the sort of the mechanistic sense, when you're burning fat. So what we found, and what the race performance also shows, is that if you're getting 4% less ATP from the amount of oxygen that's available to those cells in your mitochondria in the cells to burn, then you're going to be moving at a slower rate. And that's the bottom line. Once we saw that, we thought, oh, well, there's no way of getting around that. It's not about whether you stay on the keto diet for 3 years or 3 millennia. You don't change fundamental biochemistry. So we then thought, well, that's a brick wall. We know it's a brick wall because it's really interesting. At the same time as people are interested in the keto diet, they're all buying alpha flies. And the reason that they're doing that is because the carbon fibre plate and the biomechanics of the shoe with the springy
the foam, and then
foam, yes, and the way that you
fibre,
and the way that you're sort of running downhill when you're in them. It improves your economy. That means that it costs less oxygen, to produce the same amount of work by about 4%. Now, every record from 5,000 metres to the marathon has been broken for men and women in the last 5 years since those shoes have become available, because it just gives you about a 1 to 2% better speed if you transfer the amount of ATP that you're producing. That's work or power, but then that has to be converted into speed. So, yes, it's completely predictable that you will go faster by doing something that improves your economy by 4%. And it's entirely predictable that if you do something that removes or reduces your economy by the same margin, that you'll go slower. And there's just no way around it. It doesn't matter, people keep saying to me, but you can burn all this extra fat. And I'm saying, yes, but I don't want that. I want my mitochondria to be able to do it because I want to be able to train at lower intensities. But on the day of the race, I want them burning the fuel that's most economical. I mean, racing car drivers know that. They don't put uneconomical fuel in engines that can burn it. So we then thought, well, all right, so we've explained our results and we've explained them in a way that says it's not going to make a difference to be able to burn more fat. But then what if we could do something that allowed you to burn more fat but have another fuel there that was available that could then get to the top end and be more economical for the amount of oxygen that you've got to contribute to fuel oxidation. And remember that, when we're dealing with elite athletes, in the 50K race, probably on average, athletes might be moving at a sort of 70 to 75% of their VO2 max. So it's a bit different from the marathon where the top athletes are working at sort of 85 to 92% of their VO2 max. I mean, they are really on the red line. Yeah. The 50K event is a bit slower overall, but the interesting thing is that tactically it's won by people that do have an engine that can work at 92% of VO2 max. So when you have a look at the world record for the 50K event, it's held by a Frenchman, Johan Diniz, and when he does his very fast times in the 50K, and Jared Talent, who I work with, who is the Olympic record holder, they win the race by getting to 40K and then doing a 10K race that's completely different. And even within that, there'll be times where tactically they'll want to lose a competitor and they'll speed up. And so even though on average you might be working at a lower intensity, if you can't move at those very high intensities and be very fast when you're doing it, then you're not going to win that race. So there's no sense in nobbling that ability to produce very fast speeds at very high intensities of your VO2 max. So we're thinking, well, what could we do that allows you to still use fat, but then you've got the top end fuel? And we thought, well, what if we do all these different ways of trying to add carbs back? So we had one of our studies where we had people keto load or keto adapt right till the day before the race, and then we put carbs back in. So we had one day of high carbs, a carb loading diet, and high carb breakfast, so they had plenty of glycogen on board. And we didn't find any benefit of doing that because, and we've shown this in a previous study where we did this with lower level athletes who allowed us to do biopsies, that when you're retooling the muscle with the fat adaptation, you change a lot of the enzymes and the pathways that help you to mobilize fat from your adipose tissue or build more of it into intramuscular triglycerides within inside the muscle cell. But then you increase the enzymes that help you to move it to the mitochondria and make it available for fuel source. But at the same time you're doing that, you're impairing the pathways and the enzymes that control the pathways that allow carbohydrate to be burnt. And we showed when we did our muscle biopsy study that you reduce the enzyme that breaks down glycogen to allow it to start being able to contribute to energy. And you also, and this is probably the most crucial one, there's an enzyme that allows the breakdown of glycogen when it moves into the first pathways to go into the Krebs cycle, the TCA cycle, whatever you want to call it. This is the pathway that produces the aerobic form of carbohydrate into ATP production. And that's the pathway that's really the the key to being able to use carbohydrate for those longer races at high intensities. You want that pathway to be really responsive. You just need to keep shuttling in that carbohydrate and get as much of it being able to produce the reducing equivalents and ATP to go into the ETC, the electron transport chain, and ultimately produce all those ATP. And we found that because that's impaired, it doesn't matter how much glycogen we put back inside the muscle, you've reduced your ability to be able to use it at those high rates. And we're able to show it in our keto-adapted race walkers. We didn't put holes in their legs. But before they did their race, the second race, we got them to come into the lab and do their warm-up on a treadmill. And we got them to go through the same speeds in that warm-up as we would look at in a VO2 max test, and show that even though we had more carbs on board than they'd had in the previous week, they still weren't fully able to oxidize carbohydrate at very high speeds than they had before they'd been keto adapted. So it did show us that simply the availability of glycogen in the muscle isn't enough to be able to use carbohydrate as a very top-end fuel. When you've reduced those pathways to use it, because that's the downside of adaptation to the high-fat diet, well, you've put conflict in there, and unfortunately you've sort of lost your ability to use carbohydrate as effectively. So then we started to think, well, what other kind of fuel could be used? And we then started to think about those ketone esters that people are buying, where they're being able to put more ketone bodies into their blood. And at this stage, we were thinking that might be a good fuel source for the muscle. So in a third study, we keto adapted our athletes, and then on the morning,
you really tried to make it work, didn't you?
Well, look, as I said, I wasn't going to let this go until I felt that I'd thrown everything at it. And so we tried the ketone esters, and we did not see any benefit there, because I think we've generally shown that even though those ketone bodies might be doing something with other organs in the body, they're not providing a fuel source for the muscle in large enough amounts to make a difference. So
this brings up two questions, and we'll probably get to both of them. They're slightly different. The first one is, was there anyone or any particular group, you mentioned the difference between females and males, that actually did have a positive response from this? Like, was there anyone that you came across through the study like, oh, this person as an individual, for whatever reason, they actually do adapt to this well and it works for them? Or was it just across the board, didn't matter who it was, didn't matter gender, didn't matter any of these things, they just didn't seem to have much of a positive effect on their overall sort of elite performance?
That's a great question. I think across the studies, we've probably had one who had a better outcome their first trial. And this was a female athlete in our second study. And when she came to the study, she probably had the experience of being able to train harder than she had before, because she's surrounded by males and she was in a new environment. And she just lapped up the whole training camp. And it's interesting that when we did a later study, that in fact she was involved in the ketone ester study, and she nominated that she wanted to go back on the keto diet. Because, one of the questions you should ask me is, well, okay, you're asking people what they want to do, but if you've done 3 studies already and have shown that the keto diet is impairing performance, who's going to turn up to that 4th study and say, oh, it's me that wants to do it? Well, it's because we've always had a way in which we thought we could bypass the previous problem. And so we were always saying, look, this could be the thing. What do you think? And she certainly thought, I had a great experience last time. But when she did it again, she did not have that same experience. And I think, probably what had happened between the times was that her training had improved, and she was now probably training at a higher intensity, and so she didn't get as much of a training effect
from that
or
second
change
camp,
in the training stimulus with the second camp. So it's been pretty universal, and I have to say, look, a lot of people that have tried it really wanted it to work. I mean, they really did think this was going to be the best thing. And even during the phases of adaptation where they were training pretty horribly. You know, there was definitely a reduction in their training quality, and they often felt terrible. They still thought that this was going to turn around, you know, because and so, you know, in fact, one of them who did have an impaired performance the first time came back to our second study, and I didn't mention this. The second study was about thinking whether the keto diet wasn't something that you would do right up to the race, but it would be a bit like altitude training, where you do a block of keto adaptation. Yeah. And what you'd be doing is, yes, you know that it's impairing your performance at the time, but what it's doing is leaving some kind of an adaptation that when you come back to ground level again, or the high carbohydrate diet, you'd have integrated these new characteristics in yourself, which when put with the high carbohydrate diet allowed you to perform better. And the reason that we did this study was that in our first camps, so, you know, we had elite athletes come, and they were in Australia doing the Supernova study, and then at the end of that they stayed on for a couple more weeks and they competed in our national trials. And many of them did these huge PBs when they did the Australian Championships. And so there was this speculation that maybe this great performance breakthrough that they had a couple of weeks after being in the study was because
that adaptation.
It was that adaptation. And some of them described it to me saying, look, it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, being on that keto diet and training as hard as I did and racing as hard as I did. But maybe that may be just psychologically tougher. It's like, you know, when sometimes people say when females have had a baby, they come back a better athlete because now they know what pain is. So maybe I've done the same thing. And so, you know, we had people, you know, and we discussed this with them because we hang around with them, you know, 24/7 for the 5 weeks of the study, and you'd be having these philosophical discussions about what's going on. And, you know, these are the fascinating conversations that you'd hear, that these athletes really wanted to make it work, just like we did. And so, you know, when it doesn't, and you've got to say to yourself, well, yes, because of our lack of randomization, we've got a bias in there, but the bias is working in the favor of the diet. So if we're seeing a negative outcome, then you really got to start thinking about that, because we've amplified every placebo effect that it's going to have, and we've taken out any nocebo effect where someone's doing something that they don't want to do. So, you know, keeping an eye on what's happening mechanistically to explain it, and having a pretty robust explanation together with, you know, we've done 4 studies now, and even in the one where we did the let's do the diet and then give you a high carbohydrate recovery and then go on to compete at the nationals again, we did that and found that there was an impairment of performance while they were on the diet. That improved when they went back to their high carbohydrate diet, but they didn't race any better than the people who'd been in the study doing the high carbohydrate diets and then doing the same taper and turning up to the national championships. So there is no, you know, special altitude effect that turns you into a better person.
A question I wanted to ask you, Louise, and it's a bit of a follow-on from John's, is I think about social media, and I think about the hundreds of, if not thousands of influencers saying that this diet does this diet does that. And I often think about people who say are promoting the ketogenic diet. They may have individually actually found a big improvement in how they feel their performance or whatever it may be. And it even seems that there's some people out there who are more on the strength power types of sports who are on ketogenic diets and say, like, I find I perform better. And I often think about, is your findings clearly show that on average, that's not going to be the case. So if you're going to give a general recommendation to say that the ketogenic diet is superior, is actually most likely not going to be the case, but there are going to be some individual outliers. Would you say that's a fair assumption to make, or do you
I'd even go one further and say that there are some scenarios where the ketogenic diet might be actually beneficial. It's not one of the areas that I was working with at the time, but I'm more than open to say that if you're in a scenario where you're needing to do lower intensity exercise, where you remove the benefit or the critical need to be able to work at very high intensities, and for a reason, whether it's you don't tolerate carbs during the race or it's difficult to get to them, if you're doing something in the wilderness or some sort of race where you have to carry your own supplies, then maybe there's a cost to having to keep consuming carbohydrate during the race to be able to rely on carbohydrate as your fuel source. So there could be a reason in those scenarios to say, well, go keto, because then you've amplified the benefit of that fuel source and that you're not going to run out of it. So I'm more than happy to say that there's horses for courses. And in fact, I'm currently working with an ultra endurance swimmer who's wanting to do a 50-hour event. And, swimming's one of those sports where it's actually difficult to fuel during the event. Race walking is not, because race walkers do their event on a 1 or a 2K loop. And there's always a feed station every 1 or 2K, so every 4 to 8 minutes, and they're allowed to be handed their provisions, and they're moving at a reason. I mean, they're moving fast, but they're
in relative terms, it's possible. Yeah, it's possible to hand them stuff.
And the other thing about it is the culture of race walking is that many of them train with their coaches, because it's a technical sport, and often the coaches want to go out and see what's happening with their technique, especially during longer training sessions where they're starting to fatigue. And so you've got a coach on a bike handing stuff, and so they practice it all the time. So it's a sport where it's not usually difficult to get carbs in. But if you're swimming across the English Channel and you've got mouthful of salt water, and when you
put
feed
a pit tube in, couldn't you?
Well, you can do all sorts of things, but it's just more difficult. And so
grab a salmon out of the water, John, start nibbling on it.
Yeah, so there's all those options, but the most of them cost something too. And remember just how awful it would taste when you got after so many hours in the water, and your face and your lips and they're all swollen up because of the salt content. It's just more difficult. So here's a very intuitive sport where a keto diet might be useful, and I put my hand up to be involved in that, because unlike social media wants to portray me, there is no black and white.
No.
And I'm really intrigued by just seeing, can we make this scenario work, and show just how remarkable we are as human beings, and that we can adapt to so many different things. So
there's the second question that came to mind, and I wanted to ask you because it's something that we posed in some of the questions that we sent you, but is part of the confusion here that people do not differentiate between the potential benefits that they may have to their general health and how that differs from performance? Now, I'm not saying it is healthy or not. I don't know the data well enough, but if people, as you've mentioned, feel better generally on something like this, and maybe, there's a lot of, and we can argue until the cows come home because there's lots of mechanisms. But say, for instance, if they lose weight or they have better satiety from eating a higher fat content diet, that they seem to conflate the benefit of those, say, health aspects or even their own perception of how they feel with what actually happens in a performance setting, because health and performance are two very different things at times. And I think it's an interesting line that, as someone who works in elite sport, and I'm sure you have to tread this line of knowing sometimes to get the result that you want in maybe a one-off performance, it's not a particularly healthy pursuit. And you've got to accept that trade-off, and everyone's got to be consenting, and it's got to be an open discussion. But that's the discussion you've got to have. Do you think that happens a little bit, where people say, oh, my perception was I felt healthy, I felt better, and then they conflate that to mean, oh, it means I can run better for my marathon?
Well, I think you're right about sport sometimes being a tightrope where what you're doing is not always healthy, and you're having to find the edge where you're happy to go to. And that's pretty true about elite sport. In terms of whether the keto diet's healthier or not, we'll come back to say how people practice it's really important, but just the concept of could you be faster because you're on the keto diet? Absolutely yes, if you've lost weight. And this is one of the things that you often find with people, that their previous dietary habits were pretty terrible and they were overweight. And this was the diet that allowed them to start being rigorous about what they were doing, to train and to have a better lifestyle. And so they've improved so many things at the same time. There's there could be something about the diet itself that just sparks in people that thing that I can adhere to this. And so everything about my life's cleaned up. I'm now lighter. I'm now getting more sleep. I'm now training effectively, and you will go faster. Now, we'll never have that scenario where we say, well, let's go back and do it all again, but do a different diet, but all the other good things go with it, to see whether that would have made you even faster, because it doesn't matter if that person has done enough to improve the quality of their whole life and they're happy with the performance improvements and the health improvements they got from being lighter and just having a better lifestyle. Well, then good on them. And I'm not going to interfere with that.
No.
But one of the things I want to talk about is how we practice diets, and this is not just about high carb diets.
No.
And look, I can go back to the beginning of my career as a dietitian, and I qualified as a dietitian at the beginning of the 1980s, and this was just when the guidelines for healthy eating in many countries were swapping to this idea of having a higher carbohydrate diet. Now, what was intended was a message that says, eat whole grains, eat fresh fruit and vegetables.
Yeah, don't eat donuts.
Yes, but what happened was that two things. The food industry responds. So suddenly you've got...
Yeah, they're not silly. They know how to make money.
So you've got bucket-o low-fat ice cream, and you've got muffins, low-fat muffins the size of your head. And so suddenly you've got people being able to eat poor quality foods that meets the qualities of or characteristics of the diet that they think they're following, but it's just ultra-processed, very easily consumed food. And so technically you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, but that wasn't what was intended. Now, that same message has happened with every diet that's happened since then. Two reasons is, one is the food industry response. And ideally, if you were following that diet, what you would have done is taken out a lot of the crap from your diet, plus a lot of the extra calories. And so if you've been following any diet, whether it's keto, whether it's paleo, whether it's gluten-free, whether it's high carb, whatever it is, if you followed the guidelines and the food industry hadn't changed, it would have probably meant you were eating fewer foods, and the foods that you were eating were healthier and they were more satiating. And that's would have been, everybody gets the benefit. But when you start getting food becoming available, because the food industry is now making it, and now they're making paleo bars and they're making keto ice cream. And
it's
they're
all
making,
rubbish, isn't it?
Yeah, gluten-free, whatever. And so suddenly you've now got back into the situation, the problem that you were trying to avoid, that you've just got ultra-processed food that you can overeat with very poor quality, but you still think you're on your diet. So you're on a keto diet, but you're just eating fat bombs and keto ice cream all the time. And I have my index. I say that many diets, when they start their cycle, have really good qualities. They may be pushing a higher protein intake. They may be pushing good intake of vegetables, regular eating, and there's a few other different ways which diets are all the same. They may have different ideas about how much carb you eat and how much of something else you eat. But at the foundation of just about every diet, whether you go paleo, keto, high carb, whatever it is regularity with protein and plenty of vegetables. But then what happens is you get people becoming the lowest common denominator of themselves, and you get the food industry responding, and then you get the ice cream index. So once you can go to the supermarket and find...
That's a very good term, the ice cream index. You know that it's being corrupted when ice cream comes in these different sort of categories.
When you can say, ooh, well, I have this one or that one when I'm on my gluten-free
Yeah,
dairy-free,
you know it's an
vegan, whatever it
absolute
is.
piss take
Yeah.
when, as you said, it's the gluten-free, high-protein ice
Low
cream. And
carb.
it's like,
Yeah.
shut up, please.
And that's unfortunate.
I'm looking forward to
what
the
happens.
carnivore ice cream.
Oh,
now,
I'm
actually.
sure it's coming.
Oh, that's a good one, isn't it? Yes.
It should be steaks. Frozen
Lime
steaks.
flavoured, yeah. But that's what happens, and people still think they're on their diet. They're still proudly saying that they're. And look, the one that really upsets me the most at the moment is the vegan diet, because so many people are doing that because they think they're helping the planet and they think they're getting benefits.
Good intentions.
Yeah, good intentions, and then it's all about faux meat and faux dairy and whatever.
Yeah.
And look, I read a really interesting study recently. There's a big project that happens in France regularly where they get national data on food intake from people, and they've been doing this for a long period of time. They've got like 20,000 people responding each time, so you've got lots of data to look at. And a recent analysis looked at the amount of ultra processed foods in people's diets, and it broke the group down. It broke the 20,000 people down into omnivores, and then there was pesco ovo vegetarians, vegetarians who allow themselves to eat some fish and some
dairy and eggs and that.
Yeah. And then there were vegetarians who don't, and then to vegans. And so it was sort of like the different grades of removing
animal products,
animal products from your diet. And what was sad was that the further you moved away from animal, so the more vegan you became, there was an increase in the amount of ultra-processed foods in your diets, and that the groups that were most likely to have the highest ultra-processed foods were the people that recently started the diet and young people. And so, what it's saying is that people are not thinking about, where are the legumes and where are the ways that I can learn to cook the foods that are a part of a plant-based diet. They're just going...
And a whole foods principle.
Yeah.
And a whole food principle.
Well, I think of, and you know this better than I do, Louise, but I think of, if you look at the data of how long people stick to a diet, particularly when it's restrictive, it's usually less than 12 months. And associated with that is, if you have weight loss associated with a restrictive diet, you typically put it on within a certain time period as well, because typically more restrictive diets don't allow you to maintain them, or you start looking for alternatives, as you're suggesting, that fit into the principles of your diet, but realize in the process you're actually eating high processed food anyway, which seems to be the culprit to a lot of the problems. Yeah.
I'll tell you what, when they make me queen of the world, it's going to be all different.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question. I don't know if you've ever been asked this. So I think about weird stuff like this, so apologies for this sort of side question, but do you think the recommendation and the general behavior of endurance athletes, I see a lot of endurance athletes eat very high carbohydrate diets, right? Some of it generally, whole grains and healthy, and some of it they just eat whatever they want, right? But it's very high carbohydrate because their mentality is, I'm training for the marathon, I'm training for, ultra distance stuff, and so I need my carbohydrate content, which is the correct position based on what you've said about their performance. Does that lead to long-term health detriment, later in life, because they've consumed such a high carbohydrate proportion diet, say with the risk of something like diabetes?
Do you mean specifically like a high processed carbohydrate diet?
I'm asking the question generally, and I'll let Louise work that out and give me the answer. She knows more than us, mate.
Yeah, I'd hope so.
It's $1 million question. And I don't think we've got real answers to it. My perspective is that I think the quality of the diet's most important.
Yeah.
And I'd be hoping that the message we'd be giving athletes these days is that, the best outcomes for performance and health can be found together. And it's from a diet that promotes the healthy side, or the nutrient-rich, the whole food side, as the number one principle of eating, but then allows ultra-processed foods to form some of the proportion when they can contribute their best characteristics. And look, we know we don't need to demonise ultra-processed foods all the time, because there's some ways in which they actually can contribute to lots of good aspects of our life. Sometimes they can be somewhat nutritious. It's interesting what you think an ultra-processed food is, because when you have a look at this, the NOVA Brazilian system of classification, there are some anomalies, and people always worry about bread and yogurt as being this anomaly because, depending on the particular brand, it may fit ultra processed, but in fact it still has quite a good nutrient profile. So you can still consume ultra processed foods that have nutrient value, and sometimes the benefits of them, the fact that they're so convenient to consume, the fact that they can be taken to places where food safety and food preparation characteristics are pretty low, the fact that you can take your nutrients and take your recovery or your exercise intake with you from ultra processed foods and meet your nutritional goals in a really convenient way, that really has a benefit. And what you've got to then start seeing is, well, how much of the proportion of your food intake is that making up, and are you choosing the best ones? And so there's always room in any diet, I think, to have foods that have convenience or have just pure pleasure. I mean, I'm well known for chocolate, and
don't worry, so am I.
Yeah, and look, I exercise quite regularly. I mean, I'm a committed exerciser, lifetime committed exerciser, and from time to time I actually train, committedly for a sporting event. But one of the reasons I do like to exercise is it means I get to eat more calories, and that's where my chocolate budget comes from. But I don't eat lots of other things. Like I couldn't be bothered eating biscuits, or I won't eat any cake unless it's chocolate. I don't waste my
your extra calories.
Yeah, that's right. I don't waste it on stuff that, if I lined up all the food in the world and it wasn't in my top 5, I wouldn't bother eating that food with those discretionary calories, if you like. And I think if people have that view of choosing wisely for those discretionary calories, then that's a smart way of doing things. And we need to be people who enjoy food. We need to be people who socialise around food. So being able to get the balance of the quality of the food and the quality of the environment and the quality of the circumstances in which you ate it is really part of a healthy lifestyle. So I think that's true. So yes, I do think that athletes can eat higher carbohydrate diets without health problems, as long as they follow that sort of principle, but also as long as they keep adapting that principle as their exercise changes. So if they're not training so hard, or if they get injured, or if they retire and change their exercise characteristics entirely, then they need to rethink the way that they're eating. And unfortunately, that doesn't always happen, because sometimes, when people give up the commitment and give up the, there's just that hardship, I guess, of the athlete lifestyle where you're also dedicated, suddenly they go a bit crazy with the other lifestyle things that they do. And so it's not a time where they readjust in a good way. It might be further maladjusting. And if they've never learned how to look after themselves, sometimes athletes have this wonderful lifestyle where everything's done for them. Not so much endurance athletes who not race walkers, because they don't get paid very much. But I'm thinking, sometimes team sport athletes get an incredible lifestyle where they turn up to the club, food's all there,
everything's done, yeah.
Chefs at home, whatever. And then when that all goes away, they've got no skill set to be able to look after themselves. So you sort of hope that what we can do while people are athletes now is teach them the good habits of understanding food balance and being able to maximise all those outcomes from food that we want, but to know that when they take the exercise away from it, or the degree of exercise commitment that they've got, they can adjust it in a way that's still synonymous with keeping their goals. And they learn both the principles, the motivation, and the skill set to be able to do it.
The thing that, like part of this, obviously that's more in the longer term and what it does to their sort of longer term health. I asked you sort of about it before, and I want to ask you, and I put it in the question, both personally and professionally, how do you balance the line between that health and performance? I know that you have been heavily involved in developing, and you can probably speak to this, of application of periodization around eating, and how that sort of evolves, particularly in sports. And I know that you've worked in some of these areas. Obviously, race walking can be one of them. But, sports that do need weight cuts, that, it's hyper competitive around how heavy you are, like lightweight rowing or even boxing, things like that, where they need to hit certain weights to actually, either get in the boat or, make a weight class. How do you balance that? As I said, as a professional, I'm sure you've got your strategies, and periodization may be one of them. But personally, do you feel that you've got a position that you try and straddle? Because as a coach, for instance, I'm always having these conversations with the dietitians that I work with around, I understand that there is a process that we need to go through, but there's no changing physics. If the person has lower fat mass, they're probably going to run faster. So we need to do that in the healthiest way possible. But it makes me, on a personal level, at times uncomfortable to have to even broach those topics with some of the athletes, because they understand it's not necessarily always, healthy to do that.
Look, it's a great question, and there's so many aspects of sport that isn't healthy at the highest level.
Do you think we talk about that enough?
No, I don't think we do. And I think, it's an uncomfortable conversation, because it's not just food. It's, even training. Like,
training is, at the level they train, it's not healthy.
No, it's not. Most athletes are on a knife edge between getting injured or getting sick and not doing enough training. And, that's what they need to do over their career as an athlete, is to just to keep walking that tightrope and find where it is for them, so that they don't fall off. But food's definitely one of those things. And I have lots of regrets about my own career in times where I didn't stand up for a healthier lifestyle for the athlete. And I don't know whether I would have changed it, but I certainly feel that I didn't do enough. And I talk to a lot of my colleagues. I don't work with combat sports or weight-making athletes now, but I have colleagues that do, and we're always having conversations about how do you find the right balance. There's the combat sports are really interesting because the weight limits are very clear, and sometimes they change because only certain weight classes go to the Olympics, for example, and so you might be in a weight class that's not represented on the Olympic program, and so that during non-Olympic years you can compete at this division, but if you want to make the Olympic Games, you have to go down. No one really likes going up because they don't want to be...
They don't lose their size advantage.
Yeah. And so, having that conversation with someone is, well, do you want to go to the Olympics or not? I mean, it's a really hard thing to have, to have that conversation and say, well, the sacrifice you're going to have to make is to lose all this weight. Now, can that be done in a healthy way? And are we being objective when we're having these discussions? Because, some people have the ability to do things that are unhealthy for others, and you don't want to deny an athlete the opportunity to have an experience that could be very meaningful for them. And, and sometimes you've got people who have got entire financial careers, not just of them, but of their family. And, I've got a friend who's working in China now in a combat centre, and he says, it's a bit like the East Africans in running, that a successful athlete can basically prop up a village with the amount of money they can earn if they, become very successful. And so it's not just about, is this an ego thing for an athlete wanting to go to the Olympics? No, this really changes people's lives. This changes lives of not just that person but their family. And so it's one of the complex parts of sport we don't talk about enough.
Well, it's very much those short-term gains and understanding, what the long-term ramifications, like I'm unashamedly a fight fan. Like I watch both. I'm very big into boxing and UFC, and we had the example on the weekend. There was a big fight on the weekend, and one of the fighters came in, he was over the weight limit, so it ended up meaning that he actually wasn't even eligible to win the title. But the change in his performance from his previous fight, where he really cut restrictively to get to a certain weight, was so stark it wasn't even funny. he was a completely different and better athlete for coming in heavy. And it was really interesting, the interviews afterwards, seeing, him talk about that. He lost the fight where he dropped weight, and he said, I was just so weak. I had no punch resistance. I was hopeless. And then in this fight, he looked like an absolute monster, and he basically destroyed, one of the fighters that was considered a pound for pound champion. And it was very interesting to see, because it probably explains some of the things that you're advocating on. Is like, you're almost better off sticking on the side of being healthier rather than taking the bigger risk and cutting down the weight and doing silly things. In one of the interviews, for instance, I saw, he said that in the previous fight where he did drop down a significant amount, he said, the experience was horrible. And he said, I was in bed shaking like I had a massive fever for hours on end because I was struggling to get down to this weight. And he said with this one, he came in overweight, which is probably a bit unprofessional from a contractual standpoint, but he was eating what he wanted. He said, I was just doing what I wanted to because I thought I'm not going to make weight anyway. And then he ended up winning the fight quite convincingly. And it was just a really stark reminder of, I think sometimes people think they're getting away with it by doing these extreme things, but this was an example that it wasn't, and he clearly wasn't getting away with these sort of crazy weight cuts.
Yeah, and look, every situation is so complex, isn't it? I mean, that's part of life, and we've got to find just the best ways of battling through to make the best decision at our times, and hopefully with insight and wisdom, you'd make a better decision. I certainly look back at some of the things I've written or I've said in my career and think, gosh, what was I thinking? And I'm so glad that I've had the experience now that makes me appreciate that there's a different answer, and I'd be a better person to work with now than the 30-year ago version of me.
Where do you sit on it at the moment? Are you someone that, or even actually, how do you approach it? For clinicians who are listening to this, and we do have a lot of clinicians, usually in the physio space, but how do you actually approach it? What are the kind of conversations that, your experience and wisdom is allowing you to have? We talk a lot with our clinicians who work with us in our clinic about how you frame conversations and the kind of explanations that you give to people. And we might have lost it there.
I think we may have.
Sorry to our listeners if we might have lost Louise there.
There might just be a short pause to try and come back on.
We're just trying to get this back up. You're back, Louise.
Yes, sorry about that. I don't know what happened then. It just
we lost you for a second there.
Yeah. All right. Do you want to
That's okay.
rephrase that question or?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, in your professional practice, how is it that at the moment you sort of tackle some of these, what are the kind of some of the clinical tips that you have about how you frame these conversations, whether it be with an athlete, whether it be with their, performance team? Because we particularly with the clinicians that we have working in our environment, we're always trying to educate them on the best ways to approach even conversations, because this is a tricky conversation, and I think someone with your wisdom might have some insights for people on how to approach these discussions.
Well, I guess the best starting point is to say it's never about me and me making decisions. It's about being part of a team, and thankfully, most of the areas in which I have worked and still work, I'm part of a set of wise people, and that wise team includes a psychologist and a medical doctor, the coach, the athlete. Athletes are really a big part of the team, obviously, myself and physiologists. And so we sit around and look at all the options, and together we try and come up with the wisest decision. I think these days we'd probably listen more or think more about what this is going to do to the stress and the psychological aspects of any intervention, because you want to make sure that the athlete is not going to have that sort of really negative experience as a long-term thing. And that's not being woke and just saying, only do things if you're easy, because no, I mean, being an athlete and being the best in the world at what you do is hard, and you have to train hard. We're not trying to mollycoddle everything, but what we're trying to say is, if we go down this path, what are the pros and cons, and what would be the best way of doing it where we can get as many of the important things incorporated into the plan as possible. And that would be, balancing what's it going to mean medically and psychologically and nutritionally. What will it do in terms of interfering with the training quality? And so there's so many different aspects that we look at now, and, try and make a decision. And whatever decision we made would be monitoring how the athlete's going. And so at every point there's a chance to, reconvene and say, is this going the way we thought? Would we make a different decision based on what we've seen so far? And so,
Yeah, I love that. I love that because we talk about this a lot of, the idea of, even safe to fail experiments, and you give yourself the opportunity to keep evaluating what's going on. And I think the best practitioners that we've worked with, that seems to be their advice, is, you set a plan, you're always managing and monitoring what you've put in place, and you're assessing the risks and opportunities, and you're just open to the idea that it's not necessarily something that's fixed. So I love that you say that, because it definitely aligns with what I've seen from other really experienced clinicians as well.
Excellent.
The thing that I find interesting about that whole sort of conversation and the way it's framed is what input the athlete's psychological profile has on that. There are definitely some athletes that are much more risk averse, and there are some that are much more risk taking. Have you noticed that, either of those profiles sort of tends to shift the approach that you have, whether it's more down saying, maybe closer to what would be considered health, or more towards, okay, push the performance, even though there is some downside in the short term?
I mean, obviously, the athlete's involvement is really important, and sometimes you need to get their complete wisdom in driving stuff, and sometimes you need to actually have to say to them, look, this is what you thought you wanted to do, but all the other data that we're getting from this, including things that you might be picking up about yourself, is saying this is not a good outcome. And you might be really committed to the concept of it, but the practice of it is not actually doing the right things. And so, sometimes you have to help an athlete make that hard decision. You can't make a decision for an athlete all the time, because that's unfair, and that sometimes, that's another one of those uncomfortable conversations where, at what point do you say to an athlete, that's it, I'm not going to be involved anymore, because it's now getting to a situation where we can see harm. And
have you had to do that before?
I haven't had to do it personally where I've said, this is me out. It's generally a situation where the medical team together says that to the athlete. And I can't think of a situation where an athlete's then not appreciated the conversation and made the decision. Sometimes it might take them a bit longer to get to that situation. They have to rethink it. But, maybe I'm just lucky that I've, worked with athletes that have been in an environment where that team input does mean something. And even if it's not the moment you had the conversation, but it's in that aftermath that they can understand it and come to the same conclusion. I mean, maybe I'm just lucky, because I don't know what I would do if there was an alternate, if the athlete insisted on keeping on going down the path. I mean, that would be a really, really unfortunate situation to be part of, and maybe it's just luck that I haven't had that. But there have been times where we've really made, and it's not just about food. Sometimes it's about an athlete's ability to keep training in spite of injury. That an athlete will make it.
Yeah. We notice that a lot.
Yeah,
we
and
notice
so
that a lot.
nutrition is part of that, but it's not the final straw that broke the camel's back, if you like.
You just mentioned their injury. What do you see as the association between nutrition and injury development? And where are you placed with that? Because the more we seem to look into these things, there seems to be a building association between, obviously we know that, for instance, and I think you can explain this, but particularly people who are not eating enough food, and there's been so much evidence of this, a much higher risk of, as you mentioned before, injury and illness. But are there links between certain types of food or certain types of diet that help? One maybe, help with recovering from injury, but then vice versa on the other end, maybe actually predispose you to being more likely to have injury. And I know off the top of my head, there are definitely a few. Can you speak to that, of how they sort of contribute to injury?
We now have the term energy availability that looks at how much of what you're eating is able to be then spent on the body's processes of its well-being and its health. And if we think about the amount of food that you're eating as your budget, and you want to spend it on a whole lot of things in your life, including, let's say, in a financial situation, you've got your mortgage and you've got entertainment, you've got food and you've got health insurance and whatever. There's stuff that's important and essential, and there's the nice to haves that make you enjoy your life. And so when we think about our energy intake from food, once we've spent it on exercise, that's gone, and you've only got a certain amount left that you can spend on your heart pumping and your bones turning over and protein synthesis and keeping warm and all the things that go into making us healthy. And so when we have situations where athletes are either increasing their exercise or reducing their food intake or both, then you can find this mismatch where now there's not enough energy to go around. And so your body starts then prioritising, and it will start thinking about what can it cut down that's expendable in the short term. It's going to hope that you're going to start eating a better energy balance, but it's going to take a punt in the meantime that has to look after you until you do that. And so we get situations where we know that there's a reduction in the amount of time that's spent building new bone or turning over our bones in a healthy way. We reduce our protein synthesis. We reduce a lot of these things that we think that we can cut back on. Eventually, we reduce our ability, particularly as females, to have a reproductive life, because that's obviously going to
menstruation stops
so
often.
A lot of athletes can be in a situation where, and it's not always because they're trying to lose weight. Sometimes they're just doing so much exercise and they have no idea how much they need to eat, or they don't have any hours in the day, or they don't have the money to spend on being able to buy it. So there can be mismatches for other reasons. And under those situations, you can have people just not spending enough of their energy intake on the processes that make them optimally be healthy. And that's going to not just have, an effect on their performance, but it's going to have an effect on their ability to tolerate the training and to not be sick. And so eventually, we will have an increase in sickness, and eventually we'll have an increase in injuries, whether it's bone injuries or whether it's just, other musculoskeletal things that are coming from not being able to do the repair and recovery between training sessions. And so eventually there will be this, loss of the quality of health. And so you'll find that those side of things, it's not just, and it could be a bit ironic that if some of what you're doing is making you lose weight, you may be getting faster in some ways, but at the same time, your ability to tolerate the session and recover from it and not get sick is going down. So it kind of catches up with you. And sometimes people don't see the timescale. That's a bit different. So people just see, when I was eating and training this way, I was getting faster, but now I'm sick. But if I go back to what I was doing when I was getting faster, then everything will be better. And they sort of keep chasing the thing that's actually causing them the problems. And that's unfortunate.
One of the things that I notice with it sometimes, and I don't know if there are terms for this. I don't have an understanding of if it's in the literature, but is there a differentiation between people who, especially in the the terminology that's used between people who are genuinely not eating enough calories and those that are eating a lot of calories, but the food that they're eating is actually of poor quality, such as
they're not getting enough micronutrients.
Yeah.
Is that used in the terminology?
We are now getting to the point of saying it's not just about the numbers of energy availability, because even though it was a nice simplistic way of saying that if your energy availability drops because you're either under eating or over exercising or both, that's a problem. Because in real life, when that happens, you get a group of 20 people and all get the same energy availability score of low, but this one's got this problem, this one's got no problems, this one's got twice as many. And so we do know there's individual variability. And what we're trying to look at now is what are the characteristics of the energy availability exposure, and what are the moderating factors that might either amplify or reduce the effects of that energy availability exposure. And so we need to be smarter at being able to say to people, look, having some periods of low energy availability per se isn't a problem. We've been built to adapt to them. That's why we've evolved as human beings so well, because we can shut some things off and rebalance our energy partitioning for a period of time. But what would be the best way of doing it so that it's only a short-term thing and we can bounce back to full capability when that period's gone, and do the least amount of impairment to body systems that were sort of shut down for that period of time? And I think it's about the nutritional quality. It's carbohydrate availability seems to be important. We've done, so one of the things that's interesting about our keto diets is that they're high energy availability, but they're low carbohydrate availability. And when we've done some of our studies, we've looked at training sessions, a 2-hour training session, and we've measured a whole lot of metabolic responses during and post the training sessions. And we've found that the iron and bone and immune system responses to exercise with the keto diet are not the healthy ones that we see when we do the same exercise with a higher carbohydrate availability structure around it. And this is all short term. It's just looking at what's happening with bone markers, what's happening with iron metabolism, what's happening with immune system, what's happening with inflammatory responses. And we've never seen it go in what we would consider a healthy direction. It always seems to have been going in the direction you wouldn't like to see it. Now, we don't have data that says, well, if you keep doing this, in 3 months' time, there'll be a definite effect on your bones or your iron status or your immune system or your inflammatory responses. So I don't want to, make a blank warning about this, but I'm just saying that it's never moved in the direction that you would prefer. So, yeah. So what we're sort of thinking about now to athletes is to say, well, how would you choose a better quality diet, or how would you set up your low energy availability? I mean, if you want to lose weight, you have to be in low energy availability for a period. So how would you do it so that you get the body composition change you need, but with the minimum amount of perturbations with the energy availability side of things? Now, one of the great things that's just happened in the last couple of months at Australian Catholic University is that we have just opened a metabolic chamber. So it's the only one in the Southern Hemisphere. And we're going to be able to be doing studies that are able to measure metabolism and metabolic rate in a much more precise and interesting way than we've ever done before. And the first study we're going to do is to see, does the way you achieve energy availability have an outcome on all these effects? And what we're going to do is take some athletes who are already training and put them in a situation for a week of high energy availability with lots of testing, including a period in the metabolic chamber. And then we're going to move them into 2 categories or 2 groups, and they'll both have a low energy availability exposure for a week. And it's going to be the same number. We're going to reduce energy availability to a certain level. In one group, we're going to do it all by reducing intake of food. So they keep training, but they just eat less food. And in the other group, we're going to double their exercise. So they keep eating what they were eating before, but they increase their exercise to create the same degree of low energy availability. Because I think there's a difference in the way your body would see it. Even though on an energy basis, it's the same.
It's the same,
We
it's the
think
same
there'll
value.
be a different outcome.
What do you
I
hypothesize be the difference at the
think,
moment?
and the way we're going to do it is in men and women to compare, that we'll see some differences. But I think that energy restriction will have worse effects than more exercise. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to try and our recruitment will be focusing on people that do running or race walking or triathlon, so that the exercise that they do is going to be running based. And then when they have to increase their exercise, we'll just get them on a bike, just turning over the pedals. So it's trying to reduce the injury risk that would be associated with that.
Yeah, you can't say double your kilometres this week.
Yeah, and I
running.
think that there'll be less perturbation with that than reducing food intake.
That'd be very interesting. When are you thinking that you'll be able to conduct that?
We're waiting for the grant news, which we should hopefully get in a month, and we're also waiting for the ethics approval to use the metabolic chamber. I've had an overnight stay myself, which was really interesting. Well,
what did it show?
I didn't do the experiment. I just did the live in the metabolic chamber for 24 hours. And what did it tell me? Well, I was really surprised. While I was in there, I had to read a thesis. I was marking a thesis, and I sat down for 5 hours and didn't move. And when I looked at my metabolic rate during that period, it was almost at sleep level, and it made me realise that I can go from one extreme to the other. When I'm training for a marathon, I'll do 2 hours of exercise a day, but I can spend 5 hours without lifting a muscle. And so that's a really dangerous thing for me to know about myself. So I've got to get up and move more so that I'm not sedentary for so many hours in the day. But other interesting things, it was interesting to watch what happens when I ate food and see that increase in metabolic rate post-food, the thermodynamic improvement in metabolic rate that goes with digesting food, but also after exercise. So I did there was a bike in the chamber and I did some exercise, and then your metabolic rate, stays elevated for that period of time in the recovery. So all the things that I expect, but it's interesting when you see it in yourself. And part of what I was also thinking about was just the lifestyle of being in the chamber, because it has to be very small, because to get precise measurements involving exercise, you want as little dead space as possible. So it's essentially like doing a VO2 max, but instead of having a mask on, you've got the room, and the room is your mask. And so you want it to be as small as possible. So then what I was faced with was sort of living in, I described it as being, that was sort of part camping, part quarantine, part lunar module, because all the food and things that were going, there was an airlock. And so when I went to have my meals, someone went to the other end and put it in the airlock, and then I had to wait till they closed it, and then I opened it. And so
did you pretend you were in space, did you?
I was in space, but I also thought back to when I had to do quarantine after the Tokyo Olympics, which was the best 2 weeks of my life, I have to say.
Where were you based for that?
In a hotel. Oh,
yeah, I was there as well.
Fun?
Yeah.
I mean, I had Netflix. I'd hired a bike. I had people bringing me food.
Everyone's going to be super jealous, but I'm the luckiest person in the world, because one of the athletes that went to the Olympics that I coached was my wife, and they gave us 2 rooms back to back with a door between, and so we ended up getting double the space, and we could hang out with each other, and so I was probably the luckiest person in all of that quarantine, to be honest with you.
Because I love mine. I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
We won't hold you up for too much longer, but one of the questions we always love to ask people is, for someone like yourself who is, very much a curious person and obviously being a lifelong learner and someone who explores things, what's something that's outside of your current professional work that you're enjoying exploring or learning about, or a skill that you're picking up and wanting to kind of develop? Well,
I'm still wanting to be the winner of my age group at the New York Marathon. So that's what I'm trying to do in life. So, and
well, you've got enough professionals around you to guide you with this. You're getting people to write your training program. And
maybe you should try a low carbohydrate diet for your training.
Well, the good thing is that I haven't. So I'm not getting any slower so far. So I've gone from being
that's good.
Just an okay athlete. I've never been an elite athlete by any chance. But I got third in my age group last year, and that's just simply through not getting slower because I try a new tactic or I add something. There's lots of things that I don't do properly with my own training, and it's because I'm a bit of a sook, and it's because I'm always time poor, and because yes, darling, I'm talking to my husband here now. I will lift some weights.
Yes.
I promise.
Is John pushing you to do a few things
for my 50th birthday, he bought me a set of weights, and they've not had as much use as they should have. But when I keep adding new things to my training program, it's teaching me new skills, and some of it's about doing different things with exercise that I know about but I haven't practiced myself. But it's also a time where I'm loving just listening to books at the moment. In fact, I'm quite happy training by myself a lot of the time because I just love listening to books.
Yeah.
And language is another
I do
thing.
the same.
So I would have loved to have gone to the Paris Olympics because I would have pushed myself to consolidate my French. Yeah. No,
Are you not going this year?
From that active duty, and it's sad, but I'll be interested to watch it on telly, and I'll but in another couple of years maybe there'll be some reason for making French the thing that is the next skill I acquire, and yeah.
You can speak with Jack. He speaks French.
Wonderful. So yeah,
a little.
So it's I love just thinking of new things I can do, and ways in which you can just make it intriguing to get up in the morning.
Well, best of luck with your marathon preparation. Louise, we can't thank you enough for taking, a significant portion out of your day to talk with us and answer our hopefully interesting, maybe sometimes silly questions. But thank you very much.
A pleasure.
Look,
thank you for the opportunity to talk, because I had fun. It was great conversations. Yeah, and look,
no, we did too.
Thank you for being really insightful people with the work that you do, not just in doing this podcast, but all the ways in which you interact with athletes and make their lives much better. So well done.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Louise.